This is now lecture 3 in our ongoing discussion of missions and missiology. And our topic today is cross cultural communication. If the challenge of missions is to carry the gospel over to other cultures, other groups, so that they could hear it, so that they could trust on Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. If that's so, then the task of communicating the gospel clearly across the cultural boundary has massive consequences. It's massively critical. And therefore, every missions or missiology discussion, at least from a conservative Protestant standpoint, has to engage with this question. How do we clearly, cogently, accurately, and understandably communicate the gospel to people coming to us from other cultural mindsets? And we've already, to this point, talked a decent amount about culture and some of its complexities. And in a previous lecture, we discussed just the reality that culture has many layers to it, some of them unseen. So when we initially think of culture, we're tempted to think of it strictly in terms of behaviors. What do people do? How do they dress? What food do they eat? And this sort of thing. But we recognize together that it actually goes deeper. Think of an iceberg. You just see the top of it, but actually there's a lot. The bulk of it is below the surface, unseen. And so we're talking now about values, attitudes, feelings. We're talking about beliefs, what you think is true. And also assumptions, which is the hardest to get at. Things that people just would say, well, obviously that's normal. How could anyone think any other way? And getting at those things now is the challenge of cross cultural communication. How do I learn to be aware, conscious of my own assumptions, beliefs, values, etc.? And be aware enough of those things I've never stopped to think about in order then to communicate across to someone else who has their own set of assumptions, things that they've never stopped to think about because they seem so obvious to them. How do I communicate across that gap in order to present the gospel accurately and well? There are other ways in which culture is complex. So I'll just mention 4 here. I'm not planning to go down any of these except for the last one, but I want you to be at least aware of the concept that all cultures also have subgroups. What I mean is, we might say something like American culture, but we've got to be more honest about it as we work down through it. We might talk about Southern Appalachian culture. We might talk about New England culture, which is more in the northern side of the East. We might talk about Western culture, and we probably would separate off separately something like California culture. Okay, you've got all of these different groups. See, but I did those regionally. That's not really fair, because now what we need to talk about, if we're going to do the subgroups, would be like African American culture, which they could live in the different regions. And we could also talk about Latino culture within the United States, or other various immigrant groups. We could talk about the difference between the urban population and the more rural population. We could talk about the wealthy versus the not as wealthy. You see? Each one of those groups would have its own kind of subculture of sorts. See, but it actually is more complex than that, because we could go further if we wanted to zoom in on one of those groups, and we might recognize something like the culture of a single church, because a church or a school or a company has a certain culture. And we know this. I mean, you hear people saying things like, well, the company culture or the culture of our church. And we could go further than that if we really cared to, because it would be proper, I think, to speak of even a family culture, where you have a group of individuals that are working together cooperatively. You're going to have cultures form, because culture forms in these kind of social contexts. Okay, so we talk about American culture, and in the process, we're just skipping a bunch of complexity that's going on underneath. Pause for a second. In case you're tempted to look at that and say, wow, well, that's because American culture is so complex, recognize that that's just, I chose the example because I think the majority of you listening might be American. That's just because you know it. But if you get out of that context and you listen to other groups, You're going to discover that every culture, every country, every setting has its own complexity just below the surface. They know about that complexity, an outsider doesn't. And you've got to work through, ask questions, learn. Cultures are complicated like that. Second point that I think is worth making about just cultural complexity is that cultures are made up of individuals. So, in a future lecture, we'll talk about an idea that we've already alluded to it a little bit, but that a lot of cultural values are kind of on a continuum, more or less. So, a certain culture might be more individualistic, and another culture might be more collective. But you can recognize that every individual within every individual culture has their own variation. So, what's actually going on when we say, like, Canadian culture is here? What's actually going on is that we're recognizing that there might be a greater number of the individuals that show up around here. It's kind of, you can graph it out and say something like goes like this. And so we're pinpointing this spot as the kind of center of it. But you recognize across the culture, you've got a wide diversity of cultures. Every individual has their own set of values. And so to say something like Canadian culture is massively reductionistic because all cultures are made up of individuals and those individuals are complex. I'm not done. How about a third? Let's recognize that all cultures are on the move. So we might talk about, let's say, Filipino culture, and we might put it on a certain grid using some of the same kind of analyses we were doing earlier. So we've said it here, but let's recognize that all we can really say is where Filipino culture is, or at least our guess at, because we're trying to survey lots of individuals, where it might be today. But see, as time goes on, it might move in a certain value point. And if you get into any culture and you start understanding, you'll receive comments. I've received comments in this class to the effect that, well, our culture used to be this way, but it seems to be moving that way. And before you tend to think, or you maybe assume that that's something that's uniquely happening now because look, we have all of these things like technology, it's changing fast. I can see that the pace of change maybe has sped up in different ways, but I would like to recognize that all cultures are constantly on the move. And so it's a constant battle between individuals in the culture that are trying to push one way or push the other way. And whoever's kind of winning the day succeeds in pushing the culture in a certain direction. But the culture is never static, it's always moving, and it always has been. Finally, I'd like to recognize that we could talk about a certain culture in a certain place, but cultures also clash. Another way to say this is that all cultures exist on the same planet. We've only got one of them. And that means then that these cultures have to figure out ways to coexist, or sometimes they don't coexist very well. When those clashes happen, then we end up talking about how, let's say, Russian and Ukrainian culture now clash or influence one another. And now communicating across that divide or working between those two cultures becomes part of the cultural equation. That on this side of the equation, for instance, the Ukrainian perspective might be this and the Russian perspective might be this, and you're trying to communicate across. The two cultures are actually trying to influence one another or change one another. And that brings me precisely then to our discussion for this lecture. I said that this lecture was about communication, or just let's say it this way, it's about cross-cultural communication. How do we move across this gap? How do we communicate between cultures? How do cultures influence each other? And how do we step into a culture, not our own, not our birth culture, and interact with it? In order to build this idea out a little further first, let's start by talking about just the nature of communication itself. And for this, I'll give a pretty standard graph that's used in a lot of communication studies. The concept of this graph is that you have a sender. Okay, so I'll simplify some of these terms as we go. The speaker. Who's the one who's sending the message? Okay, right now, in this particular situation, I'm the sender. I'm sending out information. And they send across the message to the receiver. Currently, in this situation, you are the receiver because you're listening to me. Sorry. I've got a message that I'm attempting to communicate across. And so, if we're breaking this down, there's an idea in my head, or I hope ideas. And I'm trying to take those ideas and transfer them across so that the ideas that used to be in my head will show up in your head. That's the ideal. That's what we're trying to do. I'd like to get to the end of this lecture and everything I was thinking appears in your head exactly as I was thinking it. And so the thoughts that used to live here now live there. That's what we're going for. Except it never happens. Because of a certain problem, let's recognize a more complex reality here, that every message or communication situation actually has a two-way system to it. There's reciprocity. Now, ironically, the equation we're working with in right now is very limited on the feedback side. This is why I enjoy teaching in person so much more than teaching on video. Because if I make a certain point and it doesn't make sense to you, you find it confusing. Or if I say something offensive to you, bothersome, confusing, misleading, whatever, you have no way at that moment to communicate it back to me. That's not entirely, what I just said is not entirely true, because there are various other feedback mechanisms. For instance, you could like or unlike the video that I just posted. You could share it to your friends and maybe tag me or something. Hey, check out this video. And some of that information would come to me. You could email me. You could put something in the comments. There are all kinds of feedback mechanisms that are possible for you to communicate with me and give me feedback. The problem is, in this case, that feedback arrow, the arrow on the bottom side, is very limited, it's slow, and it's non-specific. If we were in person, I could see your facial expression. Some of those signals you would intend to send to me, like if you nodded. Other of those signals you might not intend to, like if you fell asleep. But it would be immediate, it would be specific. It would give me a really good, solid read on what was going on in your mind. And that would be a much better situation than what we have right now. Okay, so in general, all communication situations do have some kind of reciprocity, two-way communication. I send you a message, you send me feedback. We're actually both senders and we're both receivers. Though the choice here to designate a specific sender is the recognition that this is an asymmetrical relationship. There is a primary sender. In a conversation, there might be someone who's currently doing the talking, and that at that point is the sender. Okay, but there's an even bigger problem, and it's the problem of noise. Noise is absolutely destructive in the communication relationship. And here's what we mean. When I said earlier that ideally we would communicate across this gap and the ideas that were in my head would go straight into yours, that really was ideally, because that basically never happens. It never happens that the ideas go just directly across. There's always noise in the way. Noise can refer to a lot of things. Noise can just refer to exactly what it sounds like. It could be that I'm trying to have a conversation with you and there's someone playing the piano in the background. You can't hear my words. That happened to me earlier today. I just couldn't hear what the person was saying. That could have to do with language. That could have to do with accent. But it could be more than that. It could be that you're distracted. I remember sitting in a class and my girlfriend, now my wife, had just sent me a really important message. And so I was in class, but I was not in class. I could care less about the class. I was thinking about her message. And that can be noise, just something mentally. We'll come to this later. It could be as simple as you have assumptions about a certain group of people. The way you feel because of your past experiences about Americans is in your head. And so you're listening to an American and you think, there it is again. And it's noise. You're hearing something or it's distorting the message a little bit. So this concept of noise is any kind of distortion. It's any kind of barrier, just what the diagram says. Any kind of barrier that comes in the way, blocking between sender and receiver, and making that communication diagram more complex. And that's the subject of our discussion today. How do we, as cross-cultural senders, communicators, speakers, missionaries, how do we seek to proclaim a message, the gospel, biblical truth, across the cultural gap and eliminate as much as possible. You'll never eliminate it, but let's say minimize somewhat the problem of noise so that our message comes through as clearly and as accurately as we can manage. What can we do to do a better job with communicating our message? And here I'm going to take some time to try to further elaborate what I mean by this concept of noise or specific examples of noise. So I'm going to take you down a series of levels, examples, um, deeper and deeper ways that this kind of distortion is expressed cross culturally. As I've already said, noise, distortion, it's present in every communication event. I never in my life have succeeded, I don't think, in taking a thought directly from my head and just lifting it straight across and putting it directly in another person's head. It just never works like that. So that's always true. See, but culture complicates it, or cross-cultural communication exacerbates it, makes this far worse. And I'll give you 4 different levels in which cross-cultural communication makes things more complex. I said 4, but actually I'll give you 5. So start with this. I think the most common and obvious one might be when we're just sending a message and the mere words mean something different. So I don't speak the languages that are listed on here. I mean, I speak English, but I checked out, did some Googling, and I even tried to listen to some of the words. And in some cases, like if you listen to the word for potato, I think it sounded like papa or something. Papa. Well, I mean, that's passable in English. You would think someone is saying father. What I'm showing you here in this diagram is just the recognition that you've got words here in the first column, the sounds of which mean one thing in English and they mean another thing in the donor or the receptor language. So someone comes into a culture and they use a certain word and they think, okay, yeah, I know that word. I've heard that word before. And they discover actually, no, it's a different word in the other language, right? You get into the worst situations with this, and this happens in languages, where a word that you use innocently, you think it's just, I don't know, the equivalent of father or potato or something, and it actually refers to something crude. That happens. So, examples of this, I think we probably can get that into our heads pretty much right away because we might even experience or encounter that kind of thing. Just the simple idea of a single word, gift, that comes across, and in the other language, the example on the previous table, it meant poison. And so you say, I'm going to give you a gift. And it turns out actually you're telling them you're going to kill them. See, but that's the most obvious one. I start with that one so that we can just get the idea. But let's keep on going. Let's recognize that many cultures communicate with symbolic expressions, different aspects of body language or other kinds of communication. So I'll give you a couple of examples, but someone might, from an Anglo context, might do something like this, and they're just trying to say hi. In a Filipino context, that means it's all gone. Wala na. It's all used up. Whether that could be the food at the table, there's no more of it, or something like that. Wala na. And it's a simple signal. In one culture, it meant one thing, and in another culture, it meant another thing. See, but that's probably the simplest, barest example, because in many other contexts, a certain hand signal or something you do could have really specific meanings. Again, you have sometimes the problem of certain signals that people will do, and in another context, they're crude. Or to give you another example, many cultures have cases or ways that they expect you to do handshakes. So, in a lot of Indian cultures, namaste, or some kind of bow. Even Korean and Japanese cultures do that. I spent some time in Zambia, and if they were going to hand you something, let's say a book, they would hand you with both hands. Or if they were going to shake hands, they would hold their elbow and shake across using one hand with the other hand on the elbow. The notion of just sticking your hand out there, a little rude. And so you use both hands whenever you do anything. Okay, so an American comes across and just does the normal thing, doesn't realize that he just communicated that he basically doesn't respect the other person. Zambian men can walk together holding hands. When I was there, made some friends, got to a point where it didn't feel weird to me anymore. See, but in I think in a lot of Western contexts, that would look like the person had some issues or questions about their sexuality. Russian men kiss each other on the mouth, or at least in the past, older men did. And I've seen that as well. Okay, looks odd to me. Well, okay, it's a culture thing. Proxemics is a fancy word for how close you stand to each other, or kind of the physical space idea. When I first arrived in the Philippines, we were going to get on a bus. We were waiting. The bus driver waved us, "Come on up." Oh, by the way, there's an interesting one. A lot of times, the way I grew up, I would say, "Come this way." And in a lot of places around the world, certainly sub Saharan Africa, Philippines, it's this way. Okay, so it's just an interesting difference. But the bus driver waved, "Come on up." And I looked up in the bus and I thought, there's no more room on that bus. We can't get on. No, there was plenty of room on the bus. So we're there for 4 years. I come back and I visited the US briefly, and I'm standing in a Walmart in a line. I just did what I would do normally, walked up behind a man. He's right here. And I just came right up behind him, stood right behind him. And the man turns around and says, "Excuse me, give me some space, please." Because what I did in the American context communicated something really aggressive. I wasn't even thinking about it. It was just from my previous context. That's what you would do in a line. Perfectly normal. Okay. Oh, and a couple of others. Facial expressions. In Zambia, someone could point with their forehead. It's over there, kind of like their eyes. In the Philippines, somebody can point with their mouth. It's over there. If you wanted to say yes, someone's just asking you a question. So did this happen? This means yes. I mean, you just said yes, or at least kind of acknowledged that something was communicated. Somebody asks you a question, but you didn't hear them. You want to say, "I'm sorry, what did you say?" You could go, and that's just a, "I didn't hear that." Okay, these are all expressions that have meanings. They're symbolic expressions, but those wouldn't necessarily translate. And so again, when I got back to the US, there was a period of time where I know, create confusion because I would be talking to somebody, they would ask me a question, and I'd be listening, I heard them, and I would go, no, wait, no, that's the other context habit. The person would look at me like, "No, I'm sorry, what?" Because I was in the habit of just saying yes by raising my eyebrows. Okay, but we can go more subtle still than that. And a more subtle set of expressions would be that sometimes we have cultural grids that communicate information. So I've chosen here, a little hard to represent symbolically, but I've chosen the example of a birthday. And it comes around to your birthday. Just pick a date, I don't know, February 29th. We'll put you there. February 29th is your birthday, and you come out and you're expecting it's your birthday. People should give you gifts. But you get out there and it seems like people are expecting that something's up. You can't figure it out. And you find out that they're expecting you to give them gifts. It seems rather selfish. It's my birthday. Yeah, well, different contexts do it different ways. And there are contexts where the idea is it's your birthday. So you should go out and buy a couple of boxes of donuts, bring around some snacks, share it around. It's your birthday. It's a day for celebration. So do something nice for everybody. It's your birthday after all. And before we write that off as, well, that's so selfish. People should be giving me gifts. We stop a second. What we're saying is it's a special day you should share with people. How's that selfish? They could be justified maybe in looking across at an Anglo system and saying that we're being selfish. But in truth, it's just a different culture. It's a different framework. It's an expectation. And entire social frameworks can communicate different things in different contexts. I'll run through a couple of examples here. In the Philippines, I was pastoring at one point. We wanted to invite a family over just to get to know them and that kind of thing. And we wanted to focus especially on them. Not there was a problem, but just, hey, let's build a relationship. Let's give some special time. So we invited them over, just their family. And I just didn't understand this until later. But that gave the impression that we had some kind of big issue going on, like a big special counseling or situation or confrontation. We're going to put them in a room and just going to talk to them. They were pretty nervous about the whole situation because more typical for a social setting like that, gather a group. At least invite two families. Make it big, make it lots of people, have a great time. But just focusing on one, oh. When I first arrived in Canada, something that was just a surprise to me, and this is maybe not exactly a social framework, but it's something. You don't just hand someone your credit card when you pay in a transaction. That would be considered like really risky behavior. What are they going to do with it? So they always will hand you the machine. Well, I first arrived and I hand somebody the card and whoa, I don't want that, right? Um, I'm just doing what's expected in a US context. It doesn't work that way in a Canadian context. You always do it yourself. If I'm in a Filipino context, usually it's cash based. And so you make a transaction, you get done. It's kind of expected that you will stand there and go through and count the change. I think in some other context that would come off that I was distrusting the person, that I felt they were trying to cheat me. So I'm sitting there like laboriously going through and counting. Not at all in this context. In fact, it seems in the Philippines context, it would seem irresponsible if you don't. One more. In the Philippines, I once messaged my class and I told them, I can't come to class today. I'm feeling sick. I just can't make it. And so we'll just cancel class today. So 30 minutes later, the class comes to my house. They brought me a burger. They brought me fries. They all came. They walked right into my bedroom. They came there around my bed. They talked with me. They asked me how I was doing. Okay, and I honestly canceled the class because I felt so terrible. I just wanted to stay home and sleep. Were they then being, I don't know, selfish, irresponsible, mean, whatever? I don't know. No, they were expressing kindness. This was an expression of them wanting to take care of me. I mean, this seemed like the most socially responsible, kind thing to do. You come to the situation, you get involved, you talk. Okay, so different settings have different meanings. And we're not exactly talking about words. We're not exactly talking about hand gestures. What we're talking about is a social framework, a social structure, a way of doing things. What does a birthday mean? What should you do when someone is sick, etc.? But I can go more subtle still. Even more subtle than these is the recognition that there are values and assumptions that deeply influence our thinking, our communication, I should say. So I chose this example. I'm just using the example of time. It's probably fairly typical of Western or especially maybe American missionaries that we view our time getting things done, getting through the to-do list. That's a big deal, right? You got to get through it all. And we view that as good stewardship, right? You only have so much time. You got to use your time. Don't waste time. Time is, yeah, there's an old American expression, time is money. Well, okay, from a Christian standpoint, time is value. Life is short. You got to use every minute, that kind of thing. See, but a lot of context, probably maybe the majority of context around the world, will talk less about time and talk more about relationship. So time is something you just set aside because I'm here right now with Juan de la Cruz. I'm going to sit here with Juan and we're going to talk for hours maybe. If Juan wants my time and I love him, then I should spend time with him, don't you think? And so I heard a Hispanic missionary at one point say, here we believe that being a good steward of the time means spending it with people rather than looking at your clock all the time. That's how we steward our time. We spend it with people, relationship. Well, that's really good. So the missionary who arrives and says, got to use time. I mean, get her done because life is short. He's expressing his use of time as being a good steward. And what it's coming into the new culture as is, wow, this guy's selfish. He just thinks about himself. He doesn't care about anybody. The difference between those then is critical in how he communicates. And the final category I'll give for how communication and culture can be complicated is the recognition that you yourself, your person, is part of the communication event. So a person shows up in a new setting and their thought is, well, I'm just here. Doesn't mean anything. I mean, I have 2 ears, a nose, and hair. So here I am. But the truth is, if you arrive as a Westerner, an Anglo, an American, if you arrive like that, people already have ideas in their heads about you. Maybe previous experiences with Anglos, thoughts about the way they feel like Anglos often act. And so as soon as they see you approach in some context, particularly maybe where the history has been complicated, they're looking at you and thinking, oh, great. here comes this guy. He's probably here for our money or to start a business and take advantage of us. What's he want? And your thought is, I'm just here. I can't do anything about who I am. I'm just, sorry, I'm just here. It's the way I am. Right. So I put all of those pieces together, and it's complicated. It's hard. All five of these together, recognizing that these will make a big difference. Words, gestures, customs, values, yourself. They're all part of the communication framework, and they make a huge difference on how people view you or how they understand your communication. You've got to figure out how to navigate all of that. You've got to figure out how to transcend all of that. Just to kind of illustrate this out further, how about I'll give you a couple of scenarios and some examples of what this looks like in the real world when communication is happening. So I'm going to just read down through the example of an American speaker, Jeff, who's speaking to Yuto, a Japanese listener. Okay, so the sender is the American, the receiver is the Japanese listener. And the American says this: our mutual friend John, he speaks all of his mind. He doesn't care what other people think. When he feels strongly about something, you know exactly what his views are. I really appreciate that about him. Okay, here's what the American intends to say. The American wants to say that this mutual friend John, he's trustworthy. He fulfills normal communication expectations. He's a good guy. Why? You know exactly where you're at with John. You never have to wonder. John just says it all. But what Yuto is hearing is the mutual friend has no self-control. And maybe since the Japanese listener assumes that Jeff should understand this, Jeff maybe is trying to save face for John, and he's also trying to warn me that John is shockingly foolish, immature, untrustworthy. Because, why else would Jeff say positive things about a person who has this extremely immature communication style where he just says it all? Yuto is thinking, that's disgusting. And so maybe Jeff is doing this like, I really like him, just to kind of like be nice. Meanwhile, you're like, yeah, John's a fool, but I like him. Okay, that's what he's hearing. And the reason that they're hearing those differences goes back to deeper underlying assumptions. So the American has views about the world. If someone has strong thoughts, ideas, then you should state your ideas. Right? That's a good thing in American communication patterns. If you feel it and you feel it strongly, say it. Don't try to hold back. A person who holds their thoughts within is probably or possibly dishonest. So if you're trustworthy, you just tell them like it is. You just say it the way it is. It's a very, very American kind of feel for you. Just lay it out. I mean, people that will speak of public officials. Oh, I just love about him. He just says it all. He says it just like it is. And that's considered a positive thing. But on the other side, here's the underlying assumptions from a Japanese framework that a person who speaks all of his mind is immature and foolish. Someone would never want to speak, or would someone never want to speak so despairingly unless the situation is really serious? And even then, you'd be careful to save face for that person. So the assumptions on the Japanese side is if Jeff, the speaker, is saying this about John, the guy they were discussing, wow, there must be major issues with John. And Jeff's like, I like Jeff. I like John. I love that he speaks everything. Yuto is thinking, what is wrong in this situation? Okay, so the two people they've communicated. I'll say that. Communication has happened. A signal has been sent. A signal has been received. The problem is there's a massive discrepancy between the signal that Jeff tried to send and the meaning that Yuto actually heard and deciphered. They heard, or they said and heard, two different things. Let's give another example. In this case, I've gone with a Filipino and a German. So just reading down through the case again, the Filipino speaker comes to his German neighbor and he says, our neighbors, Tom and Kathy, they're so friendly and kind. We're grateful for them. Sometimes their music's a little noisy, especially late in the evening, and we've had some trouble sleeping, but they're so kind. Okay. Now, what Roel is thinking with this, the relationship's important. We're neighbors. I mean, neighbors need to get along. And I strongly want to preserve the relationship because relationships are everything. We've got to keep relationship. We don't want to disturb, you don't want to disturb relationship. Keep relationship. But this music is a major problem. Like my wife is just going crazy. Like it's just we can't sleep. The kids are crying. It's ruining our whole situation. It's a mess. And he's trying to communicate across to Hans. I could never go to Tom and Kathy. I'm so embarrassed. Would you be willing on my behalf to go carefully, casually convey the message for me? This is actually a kind of a concept in Filipino communication styles. Use someone else as kind of your bridge to communicate the awkward message across. Hans is, I think, like I said about Americans a bit earlier, he's just assuming what you say is what you say. It's what it means. We're done. So what Hans hears is, well, Roel really likes Tom, and apparently Roel has some sleep problems, and that's too bad to hear about. I hope he gets over his sleep problems. But Hans really doesn't go much further than that. And the reason there's a massive difference between their two views is the underlying assumptions. On Roel's side, he believes that relational harmony must be maintained at all costs. You kind of lightly, gently state a concern. You just sort of casually kind of drop it there. And then you put like lots of positives. Oh, I like them. They're great. And, there's a little issue, but yeah, they're great. And if I do that, then that should be super obvious. Is anybody who hears that goes, oh, he did the nice thing, put in the little negative in between, like, okay, that's the thing in the middle. So then communicate this for me. And another assumption here is this is the way we handle things. I find a friend who will communicate for me. That's kind of what I'm mentioning to you. And then you'll go and do that for me, right? Kind of that assumption. And Han's assumption is the main point of a message is this: you just say it. You just repeat it, make it clear, say it a couple of 3-4 times. There's no reason to soft pedal. If there's a problem, let's just say it. And best to just communicate it to the person, be done with it. Okay? Very different assumptions about how communication works. Did they communicate? Yes, but the messages they received are completely different. A quick little anecdote in here. I had a great conversation with a Filipino pastor at one point. This is a man who is married to an American, has lived in the United States, a lot of experience with Americans and that kind of thing. And he just said to me, yeah, when I'm having discussions with someone, if it's a Filipino pastor, then maybe someone or a Filipino friend, he might say something and I hear like the faintest little hint and I go, oh, okay, this is what he means. He says, sometimes then I'm with Americans and the Americans kind of like toss in a little something in there. And I think, okay, probably what he's trying to say or what he means to hint at, kind of get around to, hinting at, probably what he's hinting at is this. And then my friend said, and then I think, oh, yeah, never mind. He's American. He's just saying what he thinks. He's just saying what he says is what he means. There's no hints going on here at all. And I thought that was really insightful as an expression of this dynamic. That difference, my friend, because of working in both contexts, knows how to divide out. When I hear a Filipino say this, watch for the hints. When I hear an American say this, there's no hints. Just what they say is what they say. And the difference between those, massive. Okay? If you're listening to this from a North American perspective, probably you're tempted to say, so much better if we just say it, then we all know where we're at. Yeah, that's because your cultural values. You prefer that because it's your culture. But other contexts are going to view that as just raw, just a little bit too rough, a little bit too harsh. Now, that takes me then, worked through at this point at some length, the reality of cultural complexity, the recognition that contexts can be really different, and that as a sender and a receiver are trying to communicate their message across, that they've got to find ways to transcend, right, this concept of noise. But I want to break this down a little bit, and I want to ask a further question. Is this possible anyway? Is there a way to get this message across? And the remainder of our lecture, we're going to work down through evaluating this problem. I'm going to go down through two concepts. The first concept is kind of coming from a more philosophical direction. It's what's called the Sapir-Whorf thesis, the question of whether it's really possible to transcend this gap. And then I want to go to a biblical framework. I'm going to do a theology of languages and translation. And I'm going to try to think with you together about how scripture would speak to us about this problem. So let's start off with the Sapir-Whorf question. And this is a philosophical discussion in linguistics, sometimes called linguistic relativity. And the idea would go, some people have suggested that each language or language group is so different that we may not exactly be able to transcend between the different languages at all. I let's say, as a person who grew up speaking English, I have a certain way of thinking that's English based. Like I think like an English speaker because my language has shaped me. And so if you grew up speaking English, you just think in a really Englishy way. And if you grew up speaking another language, they have different words for things, they have different structures and stuff like that. And so those other structures will actually shape the way you think. The Sapir-Whorf thesis, or at least the hard or strong thesis, is the supposition that the structure of a language influences the way we see the world. Now, there are different observations that have been made. Certain languages lack a word for certain colors. And so if you ask someone about that color, do they have a word for it? And so the question will go, well, then, do they kind of like experience the world the same way if they don't even have a word for that color? Or another example, in Tagalog, we have a word kasama, which is the word for the person who comes with you. They're my kind of the person who accompanies me, my companion. And the concept of a kasama is pretty deeply rooted in culturally. If you're going to go somewhere, the question would go, well, who's your kasama? Who's the person that goes with you? Because assume you wouldn't want to go by yourself. Like even just, to go down to the market or something. Why would you go by yourself? You go with a kasama. You go together with somebody else. And so the thought here goes, when you have these kinds of words rattling around in a language, because there's a word for it in Filipino, kasama, then you want a kasama. But I mean, what English speaker is going to say, like, oh, I need a kasama? They don't even have a good word for it. And therefore, it's not a major part of their concerns. I think, actually, though, the Sapir-Whorf thesis has some serious problems. Actually, I'm quite antagonistic to the thesis for a variety of reasons. And I could start out philosophical. The first is the direction of the causation. Did the language shape the culture? Or did the culture shape the language? And I think between those, it's the second. In other words, the culture is a certain way. And so because you want a kasama, you have a word for the kasama. Some of the examples that come up is that Inuit people have something like 12 different words for snow. And unsurprisingly, Tagalog speakers don't really have a word for it. It's isno, which you do the English. Okay, well, can you think of any reasons why Inuit people might have 12 words for snow? Because you need to communicate about it, right? And you don't use those words in a place where it never snows, so you don't have words for it. So is it that the language caused the people to feel a certain way? No, it's the environment, it's the culture, it's the situation. The language just expresses our values. I think the culture comes first, the values come first. And sure, the language can do a reciprocal thing, I guess, but pretty much the culture values come first, and then we humans go out and find a way to say it. I also argue that most miscommunication is not on the level of the language. The problems we've talked about a bit ago are really they're existing on the cultural level. And the reason for that, remember that the two-way diagram, okay, I send a message, someone receives it, they send me a message back. So let's say I'm in the example and I say, I want to give you a gift. And the guy hears me say it and he goes, you want to give me poison? You're trying to kill me? So I see something flash across his face like, and I go, sorry, did I say something wrong? And then we figure out, oh, I used the English word. I should have used the German word. Oh, that's what. Oh, man, I'm sorry. We have this little exchange. It's self-correcting. The biggest problems we have in communication are those invisible assumptions underneath, like the Westerner that's, okay, well, I need to go. And what he just did is he communicated on a cultural level because he values time, and the other person thought he doesn't value relationship because he cares more about his time than he cares about me. See, but that was cultural, not just linguistic. And anyway, on a third level, if every culture, or excuse me, every linguistic group just inhabits like a different world, how is communication possible? See, if I'm thinking in an English way and they're thinking in a Tagalog way, because I grew up speaking English, they spoke Tagalog, it should be true that we're almost always going to have a struggle. We're never going to really understand. We live in different worlds. Like they're living in a Tagalog based world, and I'm living in an English based world. But see, on the contrary, the very fact that humans can learn languages and communicate across demonstrates that it's possible to get this done. It's possible, even though I did grow up speaking English, to still figure out how to communicate with people that have a different culture and a different language than I. And I could move beyond that without really breaking this theology down to recognize that though there are differences, we're really a lot more the same than we are different. We have 5 theological points that represent this: the image of God in man. All humans are created to reflect something about God's nature. We're far more alike than we are different. There's the concept of the first Adam, and of course, later the last Adam. But the fact that we're all rooted in Adam as our beginning, our head, and all of us come from him. We're one race, we're one people, we're one humanity. That's an important theological principle. It's also an important cultural and relational principle. A third concept is natural theology. It's the idea that we only live in one world. If you read Proverbs and it tells you about the way the world works, if you're lazy, this will happen to you. If you mess around with someone else's wife, this will happen to you. Okay, that's universal. That transcends culture. Which takes me to the fourth, the sufficiency of Scripture. Scripture is not just helpful for Jewish people living 3,000 years ago. Scripture is designed for the world. It's for all of us. Well, the sufficiency of Scripture then shows you that it's possible to hear God's words, even if you grew up speaking another language. And finally, the person of Christ. Christ came incarnated as a human, as the Word to the entire world. So if Christ came speaking in an Aramaic kind of conceptual universe or a Hebrew conceptual universe, how does he communicate to us? The answer is he can, because one person, the incarnate Jesus Christ, is given to the entire planet. Which takes me into our last discussion, and it's a theology of languages and translation. Okay, so our struggle here has been to think through, how do I transcend the gap? How do I communicate across it? How do I learn to get the message of the gospel across? And I just want to theologically demonstrate that this is at the heart, actually, of the biblical story. Scripture is not blind to communication or to language. Scripture is deeply rooted in this. This starts right at the foundation. Let's recognize that the foundation for our whole doctrine of Scripture is that God has spoken. God is the first missionary we discovered. God is the first communicator. See, and it's not just then that he created language for us, but remember that before there is us and before there is a world, the way this started, God spoke. So God is the preeminent, transcendent communicator. He speaks to us in his word. It must then be possible somehow to communicate across gaps. There couldn't be a wider gap, right, than from God himself to humanity. He speaks to us, the holy, omnipotent, omniscient God. He speaks to us, erring, failing, dying humans. And he speaks in the faith that we are capable of understanding. Communication is possible across vast gaps. I'm also intrigued, if you just look across the biblical information, I'm intrigued by the fact that Scripture quite often talks about linguistic categories. So a huge number of passages have this kind of linguistic awareness. I'm going to start out here in Matthew 1, and it talks about the name Emmanuel, but look, it gives us an interpretation. The assumption of which, I would suggest, is that Matthew knows some of his readers won't know the Hebrew, and so they need an interpretation. Here is Aramaic, Jesus speaks, and then Mark translates it into Greek. Here is another, this is in this case a Hebrew word, and it's translated across into Greek. Jesus is speaking Aramaic, and Mark translates it for us into Greek so that we know what he's saying. Same here. This is a Hebrew word that's translated into Greek, and so on. Okay, you've got quite a few of these. And even on into the epistles, you've got this interpretation telling us what Salem refers to. Okay, so all of this is a demonstration that, yes, Scripture is not blind to the reality of language. Scripture is a profoundly multilingual book. And a couple of other illustrations that support this. Moses learned Egyptian. God warns that to the nation of Israel, they will be destroyed by a nation whose language you do not understand. Daniel learns the language of the Chaldeans. Ezra reads the law and gives the sense, which probably is he translated it. We aren't even sure what languages Jesus spoke. At least we see Aramaic. There's some awareness of Hebrew. He probably spoke Greek as well. The Gospels are full of these kinds of translations. If you think of the cross, it has 3 languages on it, written there in Latin and Greek and Aramaic. Okay, so language, this is a very multilingual scenario. In North America, particularly in the US, tends to be quite monolingual. Maybe occasionally you encounter Spanish. That's not the world that particularly the time of Christ was in. And even back into the Old Testament, there's a lot of multilingual stuff going on all the way throughout. Scripture is deeply and profoundly multilingual. Remember, the Bible itself is actually written to us in 3 languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So Scripture is very much conscious of language in that dynamic. There's actually a major point in the biblical story pointing to language, and that's the Babel story. So, because of mankind's rebellion against God, Genesis 11, they attempt or they want to try to gather themselves together instead of spreading out. Remember, we discussed that this was actually because they were resisting God's plan to them. He told them to go out and they instead try to stay together. Okay, but the result of this, or God's way actually of protecting them from themselves, is that he scrambled their languages. So he confounded their languages so that they could not understand one another's speech. And it's just the recognition that in the biblical story, God is not only the author and creator of language, but he's also the source of languages. The very dynamic that we're working through here when we're trying to transcend the culture gap, it actually is based in the biblical story itself. God is the one who scrambled these languages. But the answer to that scrambling begins through the gospel story, the person of Christ. Christ comes for the gospel to spread across the entire world. It's a worldwide thing now. And a lot of different ways we can break this out. If you look at the Great Commission passages, we've done that before. Each of the passages have this international, universal, all nations, all the world kind of language. And in Matthew's case, you read, go into all the world, or excuse me, teach them the things that I've commanded you. And you're supposed to do this to all nations. Okay, pretty important to notice that you can't teach the nations to observe what Jesus commanded if you can't communicate with them. See, this is another reason that we reject the strong Sapir-Whorf thesis that communication is impossible across cultural boundaries. It must be possible because Jesus told us to do it. If he told us to do it, there must be a way. And that takes us again back to the opening point we made. We care about language so much. We're having this entire discussion, and it's so important to us at the outset. We care about it because our faith rests on a message. It must be possible to communicate this message. This message is so important. It's life transforming. It's eternity transforming for a person. There must be a way to communicate that across. And the gospel can be communicated across the language barriers. The story of Babel, you remember I talked about in Genesis 11. Well, the other side of that, like the companion side of that, is Pentecost. Pentecost is the undoing of Babel. If at Babel God confounded the languages and he created, honestly, barriers between people for their own good, at Pentecost, God has the power and he uses the power to temporarily undo that for the sake of the spreading of the gospel. And we looked in a previous discussion at how many ethnicities are represented in Acts. It's a lot. Okay, God can lead people to transcend those differences, and it's worth it because of the gospel. I'm not a continuationist. I don't believe that I have the gift of tongues, or that really anybody today that I've ever met has the ability to speak languages that they've never studied. It would be great because I gave a solid year of my life to learning Tagalog. What is the equivalent of Pentecost today? And the answer I suggest is that the equivalent is learning languages. It's the hard way. It's not an immediate miracle. But taking the time, the trouble, the patience as a believer to learn a language for the sake of communicating the gospel to people around the world, that is the expression of faith in what God did at Pentecost. And I prayed that when I was learning Tagalog. Lord, you're the one who created languages. You scrambled the languages and you undid that scrambling at Pentecost. Help me to learn this language as quickly as possible. It's worth it for the sake of communicating the gospel. And if I take it then to the end of the story, the biblical story ends with multilingual praise. Look in Revelation and you'll see this pattern that as the throngs praise God around the throne, they praise him as people, tongue, nations. This word tongue is the word languages. There's a crowd which no one can number out of nations, kindreds, peoples, languages. They're standing before the throne. And if you read in the context, they're saying things. So they're speaking words, but they're people from all of these different languages. I don't know exactly how that works. But we could say this at least. The linguistic groups represented there are diverse and many. And it's possible to praise God in all of those languages. Multilingual praise, standing around the throne forever and ever. If I was then kind of summarizing our points here, I would just want to say that learning languages, transcending linguistic boundaries, working to get across that gap and communicate the truth well, I would argue that's a bold confession. It's an expression of faith. It's stepping forward with courage to confess that the gospel is not just for my people. It's not just for the English-speaking world. But taking the time to learn that language is a bold confession that the gospel is for all people, all nations, all languages. Remember then that we ought to, if we believe this truth, we believe that the gospel is for the planet, then we ought to be motivated now to take the time to do the work, learn the language, and communicate it well. And that takes me all the way around now to conclude out our time. We've discussed in this lecture cross-cultural communication. I just want to give you a couple of encouragements as you work to do this. Number one, recognize that communication takes work. I mean, it's hard. It's humbling. It's frustrating. It's embarrassing. You'll make all kinds of mistakes. You'll feel like you're 2 years old. People will laugh at you sometimes. You're going to have probably hundreds, maybe thousands of really just bad, awkward conversations that end nowhere. You're going to sit there for hours, listen and try to understand, and it's going to be hard. Okay. But, learning some humility, that's a blessing anyway. Never hurt anybody to get a little bit of humility. And learning the hard work, or being willing to take those hits, being willing to take the struggle, it's a humble expression that the gospel is worth it. And even if it's hard, even if it's costly, I need to communicate this. It's worth the work. In fact, one of the ways it's worth the work is that learning a language communicates love for the people. A comment that just sticks in my mind from 10 years ago, while we were struggling to learn Tagalog and then trying to create conversations in Tagalog, even though it would be easier to do the English thing. Somebody just said to us, she said, we know that you love us because you're taking the trouble to learn our language. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because learning a language is hard, painful, humiliating, a ton of work, sometimes depressing. But if I want to carry a message of truth to some people, there's no other way. And language is so tied up with identity I mean, one of the ways that we even feel like somebody is part of our affiliate group, one of the ways that if you meet somebody, you think, oh, he's one of us, is if you hear his language and if his accent matches, he speaks your language and he speaks it well, then you start to deal with him as though he's part of your group. They will never view you as part of them until you learn the language well. You'll always be an outsider, you'll always be a foreigner un- until you learn the language, and probably even still after. But your ticket to learning the culture, your ticket to becoming an authentic participant in the new setting, learn the language. Always learn the language. Don't make excuses. Always learn the language. In fact, the most tempting place not to learn the language is a context like the one we were in, the Philippines, but there's lots of places around the world now that work like this, kind of a mixed English scenario where a good, decent number of people speak English. I mean, you can get a 1.3 billion people. India, parts of India, they speak English enough that you can communicate some. And you're tempted to say, great, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, Philippines, I'll just use English. Yeah, I can already communicate. And I would argue here, don't do that, please. Taking the time to learn the language so that people hear it in their heart. That's the starting place. In fact, I'll conclude just by challenging you. Your success as a missionary will be significantly correlated with how well you learn this language. I won't say this absolutely because I've seen some extremely effective missionaries who were able to do it just by loving people without having learned the language. But in large part, you will only be as useful and successful within your context as the degree to which you learn the language. Learn the language, learn it well, and you'll be that much further on in your ability to communicate the gospel to the people around you. And with all of this then put together, we can conclude that yes, cross cultural communication is hard, it's complicated, it can have layers and layers to it that make it difficult. But at the end of the discussion, God has called us to speak a message. We can speak it for Him. And so we do the work with faith, learning the language for the sake of communicating the message of Jesus Christ, so that all can hear the truth about Him. We'll continue in our next lecture to discuss how we communicate this also in our behaviors, contextualizing biblical ethics into a new context as an extension of our discussion today, the topic of cross cultural communication.